Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 21st of May 2015, and welcome to UK Column News, just after 1 o'clock. Well, here we are. The weather in Plymouth is bright sunshine. We've got reports of sunshine across much of UK, so that's the good news for today. What's happening in Britain? Well, all of the news coming into UK Column at the moment is effectively about the breakup of the country. This is no accident. Of course, UK Column has been warning over many years that this is deliberate policy between the combined main political parties, the so-called Lib Lab Con. What are their policies designed to do? To destroy Britain as a nation state from within. Now, before I get on to the main topics for the news, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the people who attended the UK Column monthly meeting in the George Hotel, Plympton, last night. A very good turnout, and I'd like to say a big thank you to all the people who travelled distance. So the winner last night was Dan, who had travelled all the way down from Newcastle just to be at that meeting. We had other people who had attended from Swindon, and we were delighted to say some new supporters appeared from Plymouth. But what was extraordinary about the meeting was a lady called Christine who simply appeared to tell the harrowing story of her fight against the abuse of her son by the NHS. A harrowing story, and at the present stage, mother and 40-year-old son are effectively on the run as British courts threaten her son with sectioning under mental health laws for producing a highly detailed report cataloguing the abuse that he had suffered at the hands of the NHS. Now, these stories are not unusual. We're hearing them not only to do with what's happening with the NHS, but of course, we're particularly hearing it to do with social services and the taking of children by the British state. So that probably leads us into our first article this afternoon, and let's have a look at what Theresa May is attempting to do with Britain's police force. The Guardian here saying that police warning that big budget cuts will lead to a paramilitary force. Steve White, chair of the Police Federation, says the service is on its knees and predicts the end of policing by consent and a move towards a more violent style. Well, that's a very interesting statement. We'd like to ask, how does a supposed lack of money result in the police being paramilitary? Because if we think this through, of course, all of the paramilitary equipment which the police now have, from their flak jackets to tasers to batons, pepper spray, CS gas, and indeed weapons, all of this has cost a vast amount of money, but we are being given here what is basically misleading nonsense that is the cuts that is driving the police towards an increasingly brutal style of policing. Of course, the truth is that it is this woman in particular that has been implementing the policy which has been moving the police towards a paramilitary style of policing. But Theresa May, as Home Secretary, coming under great pressure at her recent meeting with the Police Federation. Well, what was she told, or what was stated at the meeting? Well, the Police Federation Chairman Steve White said that the Bobby on the beat was becoming an endangered species and neighbourhood policing was under serious threat. Ms May said, "I have to tell you that this kind of scaremongering does nobody any good. It doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve the officers you represent, and it doesn't serve the public." But a delegate retorted to Miss May, "I've never known a time in the last 25 years when police morale has been so low. Officers feel they're under sustained attack from the media, the government, and additionally the Home Office. At times, our only allies are the public that we serve." Now, that is a very telling statement, because we would thoroughly agree with what this policeman has said. It is indeed an attack on the police by the government and particularly by Theresa May and the Home Office, which is doing the damage. This is calculated Tory policy. Let's have a look. by cutting the 20% with rapid privatisation, Cameron is deliberately destroying traditional policing to create a bank and government-controlled private army. And of course, we need to remember that Theresa May is already on record of saying, well, if you police can't behave yourselves, then police will be taken under the direct control of the government. Why is that so significant? Well, of course, Britain has enjoyed for many years policing by effectively a civilian police constabulary that polices by our consent, the public giving permission to be policed in this way. If Theresa May is to take control of Britain's police under government control, we have taken a major step into this David Cameron style police state. And let's remember that, of course, while Theresa May has been in post as Home Secretary, we've seen absolutely no progress on investigation and bringing to book of paedophile rings, and particularly those paedophile rings associated with Westminster, politicians across the three parties, and the wider establishment, including senior police officers themselves and judges. Let's remind ourselves that Theresa May was very outspoken on the Andrew Marr show, where she said, how was it, Andrew, the very institutions of the state that should be protecting children were not doing so? So with unbelievable sincerity, it was Theresa May who had conspired to place members of the establishment linked to those accused of child abuse as head of a child abuse inquiry. And this woman is trying to tell the nation she doesn't really understand how there's no proper investigation. But what Theresa May, and indeed the Scottish junta, which we've reported on before, have been extremely good at doing, is in imprisoning those, such as Robert Greene, who have spoken out to expose child abuse. Let's also remember Melanie Shaw, still sitting in a private profit-making Sodexo prison in Peterborough, simply because she has dared stand up and warn the nation about paedophile rings abusing hundreds of children with links to Britain's political establishment. This is a very serious state of the nation, but it's becoming ever more clear that the true criminality is, of course, in Westminster. Well, perhaps we get another example from this report from the Mail. Very interesting as to what is actually happening, but Cliff Richard has apparently put up his Berkshire Art Deco home. He's put it up for sale at a mere 4.75 million. I think he has another 3 properties. But of course, Cliff Richard, under great pressure due to police investigations, and although he's being supported by Cilla Black at the moment, the reports are that he is in a very bad place. Well, I think it would be fair to say that if there are allegations which can be substantiated against Cliff Richard, then of course the police should be progressing those allegations. But what do we see? We see much hype in the media about possible action, but we see little actual progress. The same is true with Elm House, the same is true with Operation Daybreak, the same is true with Dolphin Square. Is this accidental? We don't think so. Well, if that's the situation at home, what's been happening overseas? Appalling scenes of death and carnage in Syria. The Mail glorifying this slaughter of innocent men, women and children, because not only has it posted these graphic pictures, but it has then followed up with picture after picture talking about what the terrorists are doing. So here was the headline, the slaughter of citizens begins. First images emerge from a Syrian city, Palmyra, overrun by ISIS, and show rows of people beheaded as terror group celebrates freeing Islamists from state prison. Well, The Guardian, surprisingly, has got a rather different take on it, because they've been saying that this is Cameron's unthinking policy, which has fueled the rise of British jihadism. Let's bring in the real man behind the scenes. Here he is, David Cameron, also known as Tony Blair Mark II. And of course, the brutal deaths and suffering in Syria have been the direct result of Cameron's calculated support for terrorists and his deliberate undermining of the Assad government. We'll remind ourselves of this gentleman, Conservative MP Brooks Newmark. Remember that he was boasting back in 2013 that he'd been on the Syrian border where he met General Idris, the leader of the Syria Free Army. Here's General Idris. Brooks Newmark went on to tell the British press, I told him, hopefully, airstrikes and missiles would soon be raining down on Assad's military infrastructure. He also commented that there were about 150,000 Free Syria Army fighters and 7,500 Jabhat al-Nusra fighters, which have links with al-Qaeda. So here we have a British politician speaking with General Idris, a man linked to the very terrorists on the rise in Syria, but boasting that the legitimate Syrian government was to be bombarded by British missiles and bombs. So bizarrely, we appear to have the Conservative Party supporting the very terrorist organisations that are now carrying out the atrocities in Syria. Who's to blame? Well, of course, it's Prime Minister David Cameron. And we now have the fear-mongering amongst the British public that Syria is attracting and empowering a new cohort of al-Qaeda-linked extremists. Well, the truth of the matter is that the terrorist threat to Britain, of course, has been engineered by Cameron himself. But let's remind ourselves of those key words from Mr. Newmark, Tory MP. I told him, General Idris, hopefully airstrikes and missiles would soon be raining down on Assad's military infrastructure. And of course, what sort of man is Brooks Newmark? Well, here is a British politician in his full glory, of course disgraced after sending some pretty unpleasant pictures to ladies over the internet. Well, at home, the allegations about conditions on board Britain's Trident submarines is still hitting the press, not surprisingly. It's taken Russia Today to continue to report on this, and their latest article says that Ewan Bryson, who was a Royal Navy sailor and served on HMS Ark Royal and HMS Illustrious, said that he'd also heard that these conditions of problems with everything from firefighting to morale to the condition of the nuclear reactor, that these things were true. UK Column's take on this remains that whilst we know that there have been substantial problems on board Britain's nuclear submarines, including 44 fires in some 4 years, problems with spare parts, problems with maintenance, we would like to make sure the British public is aware, of course, that the Royal Navy can only act with the equipment that the government essentially provides. And what David Cameron's government has been doing, as with the police, is successive cuts, unlimited reorganisation, which is now impacting on the performance and safety of Britain's nuclear deterrent. So let's keep the focus where we should keep it, which is not only the problems on board that submarine, HMS Victorious, but of course the Tory party behind the scenes. And the government continues its sell-off of the nation's assets. Here's a YouTube clip pointing out that we've now ended the RAF's Coast Guard provision. That has been handing over to a private contractor in what I believe is a £1.9 billion deal. What's really happening in Britain? Well, we state it again, we will keep stating it. Of course, what we are actually talking about is treason by our own government. This is being carried out by the deliberate undermining of established public services, be it the police force or the armed services or the NHS. It's treason indeed. And the thing is that it's being carried out in a piecemeal approach, which many people still are not joining the pieces. We say that the UK is being attacked by our own government, and of course this is treason softly spoken. Let's just remember where this sort of government leads, where any of us, innocent or not, can be placed not only in prisons but also in mental health institutions. Well, on that unhappy note, we are going to move over to a recording of an interview between Mike Robinson and Mark Anderson of American Free Press, where they'll be discussing the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Obama's political moves to try and move through agreements without bothering to consult Congress. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a mirror image of the way that David Cameron behaves in British Parliament. Over to Mike Robinson.
Okay, once again, joining us from the United States, we have Mark Anderson. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you doing?
Very well, Mike. Thanks for having me on again.
Brilliant. Well, we are going to start with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because in the last couple of weeks, there's been attempts to pass Obama's fast-track scheme, and that was initially defeated in the Senate as a result of all the Democrats voting against that, and in fact Obama's only support being the Republicans. But then I saw there was a couple of days later there was another attempt to push that through. So what's the actually you've got this on American Free Press at the moment. So what's the background to this, or where are we at with it at the moment, Mark?
At the moment, we're at practically ground zero, D-Day. All indications are that the U.S. Senate will vote in some manner today, the 19th of May, 2015, Tuesday, to advance in some way, shape, or form the legislation, or at least remove the barriers to getting legislation to President Obama for this fast-track authority for the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This Trade Promotion Authority, as it's formally called, that Obama wants, as you mentioned, Mike, has created a strange situation. He's actually stumping for something largely supported by Republicans, and the vast majority of pro-labor, pro-middle-class Democrats oppose either the trade deal itself or at least some of its details, and they tend to oppose this fast-track authority. So it's almost as if Obama's become a Republican. It's very strange and ironic and paradoxical in that sense. But today is the day that all eyes are on the U.S. Senate, including my own. And that's why I wrote that Advance American Free Press piece, to really get the warning out to all readers, but mainly American readers, to call their congressman and at least slow down this machine.
So, I mean, what is he playing out at the moment? Because he's losing support hand over fist from his own party. And it's almost like he feels he's only got less than a year to go, and he doesn't really care anymore what his own support thinks, and he's just going to go ahead with the sort of communitarian corporatist agenda. Is that an unfair assessment of what's going on?
No, it's not. In the American experience, the lame duck president, that is the president that served his 2 terms and no longer has to worry about re-election, always presents the same general problem, that they lose that re-election touch. They really don't care as much what they do, a little bit about their legacy maybe, but they just don't have that sensitivity to the voters they used to have. And so I think you're right. Obama did do one good thing. He reportedly cut the process, trimmed it back, whereby American police departments were getting military gear, surplus military gear. He did cut that back, apparently, and that's a good thing. However, he's raising the bar on communitarian community policing, which has some negative aspects. So there's a trade-off there. It's hard to see yet where that's going because that's a fresh issue. But, you know, back to the Trans-Pacific deal, this is a very pivotal day, and it's going to affect the UK viewers of your show and everyone across the world, because remember, this is not for Obama just to get fast-tracked for the Trans-Pacific trade deal. It's also for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that takes into account all of the UK, all of Europe that are members of the European Union. So this Trade Promotion Authority is for both trade deals, not just the Pacific one.
Okay, so before we talk a bit more about TPP and TPIP, the European version of it, the acronym escapes me at the moment, TTIP. Yeah, what impact do you think this is going to have on the presidential election? Because is this going to have any effect on it? Are the American people concerned about Obama's behavior in his last 10, 11 months?
It might have some effect in terms of if a traditionally Democratic position, that being skeptical of trade deals, suddenly becomes pushed forward by a Democratic president and the Democratic Party pushing for a decidedly Republican trade philosophy, then that's going to have kind of a viral effect, sort of a secondary effect on other Democratic candidates. Pretty soon, Hillary Clinton, whom the media has just decided is the darling of the Democratic side for president, pretty soon she's going to have to explain why a sitting Democratic president is being so Republican about trade deals. And so it's going to have an effect on a lot of congressional and presidential candidates on the Democratic side. And then Republicans are going to have to, state their position, just like they're doing on the Patriot Act, another issue that we might touch on today. A lot of the Republican presidential candidates are talking about that, but we'll deal with that perhaps in a few minutes. But yeah, it's going to have some kind of effect like that, where they're going to have to explain themselves. But the one factor is that on the Democratic side, there's not nearly as many candidates as on the Republican side. There's basically Hillary Clinton, the independent Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, and then there's possibly Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. So that's the way it's shaping up now. But yeah, you ask a good question. So
now, of course, this isn't just simply a trade deal, because it's not just about trade. It is building new institutions effectively, and effectively building a layer of governance, which theoretically, at least at this point, appears to have the potential of ending up superior in terms of sovereignty over nation states. Now, of course, on the TTIP side, which is the European side, we've got the United States on one hand and the European Union on another. So it might be relatively difficult to get in the way of that. But who are actually the counterparties on the Trans-Pacific side? And what do you think are the chances that one of the other nation states involved in this is going to put the kibosh on it in some way?
Well, that's hard to say. One thing I do know is Japan has a minister, and I've got a file on it here. There is a Japanese pushback. Even in a distant sense, it could be Japan, because a Japan, let me get it here. Okay, let me see, what was his name? His name is Yamada, Mashiko Yamada, a lawyer and a minister in the Japanese government. And he is criticizing the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, I believe you say. Yeah. It's ABE like A, but I believe it's Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe has had his arms twisted by the Trilateral Commission, and probably through connections from the Trilateral Commission to the Bilderberg Group, to accept lowering Japanese tariffs on, on grains, beef, pork, dairy, sugar, and particularly rice. Now, this is a huge deal. So Japan could be very adversely affected by having its domestic pork and rice and beef and sugar economy undercut by heavy imports of those items into Japan under the TPP. So the domestic industries in Japan that produce those very things, including more rice than Japan could ever consume itself, would be undercut by this same old trade deal, the same old dumping that happens. A lot of free traders wouldn't call it dumping, but that's really what it is. Why should any country import that item which it already produces itself in easily sufficient quantities? Japan has no reason to import rice. In fact, they should be a net exporter, and yet under the TPP, they'd be looking at importing things that they already have plenty of themselves.
So that can only have one impact on their domestic production.
Yeah, see, what happens is the supply chains get longer. Rather than a rice grower growing rice and a rice consumer in Japan being a few miles apart and one producing and one eating, suddenly the rice consumer in Japan is eating rice grown 3,000 miles away. And we're talking about perishable items. These aren't televisions and computers. And so you see the insanity of free trade right away. It's just nonsense from start to finish. The legislators argue about details, like labor regulations or environmental strictures, but the trade deals are fundamentally flawed. It's not just one part or another. They're based on a fundamentally flawed philosophy, and that's long supply chains, less national food security, less national self-sufficiency. That's the way it works because everything is strung out in this international global system, in this matrix. And it's just hopelessly unwieldy and unworkable and expensive and complicated.
And for those who don't know, which other than Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, what other Pacific nations are involved in this?
Oh, right. You're asking me right off the top of my head. Let me see. Australia, New Zealand, Korea, that'd be South Korea, I believe, Vietnam, and Japan. China's not part of it now. China and Russia are sort of in a quasi-alliance, and they're going their own way, through the BRICS Association.
Yes.
And the other groupings over there. It's quite a shell game, let me tell you.
Okay, and what are the timescales then? This legislation is being discussed as we speak and may be passed today for the fast track. But what are the next steps as far as TPP is concerned?
So much hangs, Mike, on the fast track vote that could happen today. If Obama doesn't get fast track, it's going to definitely slow down the negotiation process to wrap up the 12-nation TPP, which includes the United States, Canada, and Mexico, by the way, and even countries in South America. It straddles the Pacific Ocean. So if he doesn't get that authority, the only answer is a lot longer, significantly longer. If he does get that authority, I think they want to try and wrap this up by September, October, I'm hearing. Of course, those might be rosy assumptions, but that's what they're talking.
And I did allude to this, but what is the consensus among the American population about TPP? Have they any knowledge of it? Do they know what the implications are for it? Is there a big resistance to it?
There's significant resistance when the people are informed. There's a lot of nonprofit groups. Food Democracy Now! Comes to mind, and others, the Coalition for a Prosperous America, Public Citizen, those are three of them, that are doing a respectable job calling out flaws in the TPP and coming out against this trade promotion fast track authority. The only thing is that, as I've indicated in this article you're showing posted on AFP, a lot of the press and whatnot, and a lot of even the opponents of these things, they take issue with certain parts of the trade deal. But a lot of them, most of them, if not all of them, they don't state flat out that the best TPP is no TPP. There's very little fundamental disagreement with the overall trade treaty. They tend to pick apart these different aspects, which is why I strongly believe there's controlled opposition to the TPP, at least in some quarters. And so they generate money, they bring in donations through internet appeals. Hey, let's defeat fast track, let's defeat this treaty, or we don't like parts of this treaty. But meanwhile, these nonprofits are making money.
Right.
And so you really got to wonder about their sincerity. Some, I believe, are sincere. But when Americans know what's going on and they know the real score, they generally oppose these things. But the U.S. mainstream press is to the man. Every paper you pick up is an apologetic in favor of fast track, in favor of these trade deals. It's amazing how they can all be so unanimously in favor of it with no dissent whatsoever. I just don't see how that happens, even the law of averages.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, if we could just bring the AFP article up just once again, please. Mark, I was interested because you mentioned the police there a few minutes ago, and I was interested that the front page of this week's American Free Press, the main headline is "Stand with Cops, but Against the Police State." And you were talking about the so-called militarization of the police, and the fact that the police in the United States are increasingly using military or ex-military equipment and looking. I would imagine they're probably dressed in black quite a lot. That's certainly what's happening in this country, and actually in this country, in quite a similar way, we're seeing police armed because we have a tradition of not having armed police in this country, but police are increasingly armed, and we're seeing armed police appearing at more and more types of call-outs. It's quite an interesting development. But you were talking there about Obama having stopped the continued militarization of the police in the States by removing the budget for military equipment being placed in the hands of the police. Is that a genuine move, or is it simply a case of, well, the job's done and we don't need the budget anymore?
That remains to be seen, Mike. This just happened, and I've been very busy with the Trans-Pacific deal. It's sincerity is the word. What does this really mean? Will the cuts come right away? Will the cuts of military surplus equipment to police happen down the road? I've yet to dig into that. The article you're pointing at that was posted on the AFP website has to do with pointing out that police do serve an important function, and they do deserve some, reasonable sense of public trust. But however, that line can be very thin and very fragile, and as soon as police cross that line, armed with military surplus gear, then they no longer become our protectors, but they become our tormentors, the appendages or the agents of our rulers. And police are not supposed to oppress us, they're supposed to protect us, and they're supposed to be very even-handed. I, for one, would prefer an unarmed police force. I don't buy the argument that a police officer is inherently more trustworthy to have a gun than a regular citizen. They don't screen police applicants like they should. A lot of them are ex-military themselves, and they come back with a public is the enemy mentality brought back from Iraq or Afghanistan. So you have that too, the post-war mentality of police officers that used to be soldiers. And then you give them military surplus gear, and what are they supposed to think? They look at the populace almost like they're back in Iraq or Afghanistan. So there's a lot of issues to deal with, but Obama's move is a welcome one, but we got to trust but verify. We got to get the details, and we can talk about that soon on your show.
Okay, well let's move on then. The next article that you wanted to mention was from Union Leader here, and you're talking about the Patriot Act. And what was it? You were suggesting the Patriot Act might be rolled back a little bit. What's going on here?
Yeah, that's really important. It has implications for everyone all over the world. If the U.S. would roll back the Patriot Act, that would set a good example for the U.K. to roll back their surveillance acts. As you know, the Patriot Act was passed in the heat of the 9/11 attacks in October or November of 2001, and 9/11 happened just in September of that year. And so next thing you know, we have troops going to Afghanistan. We have the Patriot Act. Section 215 of that act authorizes all this surveillance of Americans, and that's where the surveillance state, at least the modern version of the U.S. surveillance state, largely grew out of that Section 215 of the Patriot Act. So now 14 years later, we have an NSA, National Security Agency here, taking many of its cues, and kind of deriving its authority from Section 215 of that act. And now finally, key components of that section that have to do with surveillance and a lone wolf provision. And, well, actually, let me get this straight. Section 215 itself, plus the lone wolf provision and some other matters, parts of the Patriot Act, are set to expire June 1st, just a week or two away, unless Congress intervenes and reauthorizes those parts of the act that are supposed to sunset. Now, the act has been reauthorized in the past, but just like the Trans-Pacific deal, this is another thing to watch very closely. And Rand Paul announced in the Union Leader, the New Hampshire paper, that he intends to take this fight and really go to the mat for it. We can hope that he's true to his word. He is a presidential candidate on the Republican side. He might be a little bit more hesitant about saying certain things or doing certain things, but he seems sincere. We'll trust but verify. We'll see what he does. He's supposed to filibuster this and put up a roadblock and say, hey, we can't just reauthorize this thing on the fast track. We've got to let Section 215 go down the toilet where it belongs, and then we can start pulling back on the U.S. police state that section authorizes.
I mean, do you think the legislature actually has any control over the NSA at the moment, or are they just utterly out of control?
That's almost like saying, does the legislature have any control over the CIA?
Yeah, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm just interested to see what you say.
I would think maybe only a little more than the CIA. Once those big spy agencies become entrenched with a lot of money and a lot of authority, like Section 215 of the Patriot Act supplies, then they become almost impossible to pull the plug on. It's almost like having an appliance and you unplug it from the wall and it keeps running. You're going, where the hell's the power coming from, right? And so it's a tough thing. The NSA, there's also the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the NSA, even the FBI has become a quasi-intel organization. And so you have a whole apparatus there of the federal government. And Google and large telecommunication companies play kind of an auxiliary role in this. And there's a lot of vested interests, a lot of very juicy contracts, and that they're all connected with the military. And that's a huge apparatus. That's a lot of wires to cut. To disarm all that. So, I wish those questions were as cut and dry to answer as I would like for your show here. But Congress could cut the budget and make some adjustments, but serious cutbacks or deep sixing the NSA itself would be pretty hard to do at this point, especially with the war on terror still going.
Allegedly still going. What is the situation with ISIS in Mexico at the moment?
Well, that there's allegations. There's always allegations that so-and-so living in Walla Walla, Washington, suddenly became a mercenary, suddenly decided he hates America, bought a gun, and the federal prosecutors had him picked up because he's going to go join ISIS. He's going to, forget his family, forget all his friends, quit his job, and go fight for ISIS in some hopeless satrapy overseas. And so they imply that ISIS could be anywhere. Your next door neighbor might join ISIS, let alone that there could be ISIS units just over the U.S. border with Mexico. But these things are just told to us. We're supposed to believe them because we're told they're true, which is, of course, the way the media is and the government is in the UK and America. We say it's true, therefore it must be true. We don't need evidence. We're above evidence.
Yeah, it's 1984. It's newspeak.
Right. If we say ISIS is there, they're there because we said it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to our final story for this little section. Then the House readies vote to renew the charter for the Export-Import Bank. Now, many people in Britain won't know what the Export-Import Bank is. So why don't we start with if you tell us a bit about what that is and what purpose it has served. Sorry.
Simply put, the Export-Import Bank is an apparatus of the U.S. government. It's not really a private bank. It's kind of like the Postal Service. It's got kind of a private aspect to it, but it's largely a government institution. And what they do is this is boiling it down, they loan money to other countries to buy American goods. So if a foreign country lacks the purchasing power to buy American cars or other kinds of durable goods, whatever it might be, I believe it also includes agriculture, we extend credit to that foreign buyer to buy the American exports, the American goods.
That's spectacular. So that's both a subsidy for American manufacturers, perhaps, but it's also debt to the counterparty country, which then has to pay that back at some kind of interest.
Exactly, and the Bradbury pound and similar monetary suggestions or proposals here in the States, similar to the Bradbury pound, would of course erase this whole thing. If each country had enough purchasing power within its domestic sphere, they could easily handle buying a certain degree of imports. Of course, a country should be largely self-sufficient. It should make everything its own population needs and then only export its surpluses. And so if you adjust everything and make it so each country has enough purchasing power, it would diminish the need for one country to loan another country money to buy goods. Why is it that that foreign country lacks the purchasing power to buy American goods in the first place? And it becomes kind of a Gordian knot of tariffs and monetary policy. But simply put, opponents don't like the Export-Import Bank because they don't think taxpayers should be paying foreign nations to buy American goods. Those that do back the bank think it's a necessary evil, if you will, that our exporters, American manufacturers, our own country lacks the purchasing power to buy the American output. So our productive output has to be sent overseas because Americans don't have the money to buy it all. And so the backers will say, yes, the Export-Import Bank ought to exist. It ought to make it possible so we can sell our productivity here through exports, because then these foreign countries have the buying power to obtain these American goods. So that's the basic argument. Republicans are in charge of the House Banking Committee, the House Financial Services Committee, and they're the ones that are against this taxpayer boondoggle as they believe it is. If they get their way, then Export-Import Bank will sunset possibly as soon as June.
Right, so that'll be it gone, possibly as soon as June. I'm surprised that other nations involved in the various trade agreements aren't complaining about, or at least campaigning for that to happen, since if the US government is subsidizing US goods in that way with foreign countries, then of course it's more difficult for German or British companies to compete.
Yeah, and we complain about China doing currency manipulations so their exports are cheaper and doing other things to subsidize their exports. But in fact, a lot of countries subsidize their exports. So the backers of the Export-Import Bank will say, hey, other countries subsidize exports, so this is our way of doing it.
Right.
And they have a point. The U.S. government vastly overspends, of course, in many ways. Actually, what happens is they overspend militarily and in some other key ways, but they actually underspend in other matters. It's not really overspending so much as a misallocation of funds in the United States. That's what's really happening.
I mean, is there any evidence that the money which is going to other countries in order to provide this subsidy is being used for any other purpose?
I don't know right offhand on that one, Mike. That's a good question. This Exim Bank, as they call it that for short, Exim Bank, just kind of came on my radar as of late. I was looking at it a little bit last year, and it's not one of my main focus issues, but here it's coming up just as the Patriot Act might sunset, just as Obama might get fast-tracked. Now we see Export-Import Bank waiting in the wings, and it too could end up sunsetting. And it's worth mentioning just because the other issues have a way of obscuring it and covering it up. But it's an important one. I don't really take a position on the Export-Import Bank. If I don't know all the nitty-gritty details, I tend to hold back on taking a position. But I do think that monetary policy across the world, if it were done right, then these things wouldn't be needed, as the Bradbury pound would be one way of doing that.
Indeed. Okay, well, look, we're just about out of time, Mark, but before we go, what's the latest on your Bilderberg preparations?
Well, I'll be landing there just in time in Austria, and Bilderberg's fingerprints, of course, are all over the TPP and the TTIP, Pacific and European-U.S. trade deals, and they would definitely back fast-track authority. These are Bilderberg issues. One thing to keep in mind about Bilderberg is whatever they may discuss at their annual meetings, the long-term issues for Bilderberg are global consolidation. So they're going to want a Pacific Union to go hand in hand with the Trans-Pacific trade deal. They're going to want an Atlantic Union or a transatlantic political union to go hand in hand with the TTIP trade deal. They're working on their African Union in conjunction with the Trilateral Commission. These are the ongoing big picture things that Bilderberg supports, whatever their details might be from year to year about discussing technology trends or discussing Ukraine, where they're very anti-Putin, by the way. But yeah, everything's taking shape. Every meeting is different for Bilderberg, but it's going to be interesting. And a lot of this you don't even know until you're on the ground. It's a very hit the ground running kind of thing, as you know.
So they haven't published an agenda yet?
No, they don't even have the Austrian meeting listed on the official Bilderberg website, which is a little strange. Now and then I send them a note, and they send me kind of a sarcastic reply. Well, Mr. Anderson, we follow Chatham House rules, and we don't have to disclose this until so-and-so time. So they wait till the last possible minute or even after the Austrian meeting is done before they'll say anything about Austria, probably at the last minute. The meeting is June 11 through 14. I expect they'll have something maybe posted June 5th or 6th. But they're very arrogant about it. It's really kind of a stealth transparency. They act like they're becoming more open, but they're not really more open at all. They're too vague and too late and tardy in what they do release. And so it's really a bogus transparency. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thanks again, Mark. That is brilliant. We'll end it there for today, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Okay. And I mean, just any other closing comments?
Well, today's the big day for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. At least that's what I'm understanding. All eyes are on the Senate. Let's watch that. And American viewers, call your congressman, because the defeat of Fast Track is a black eye for Bilderberg. We'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, today is Tuesday, and we'll be putting this interview on tomorrow, Wednesday's UK Column News. By then, we'll know what the details are, and I'm sure Brian will update everybody then. Thanks again, Mark, and hopefully see you next week.